Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for once again tuning into the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Ayana Janae, and this week we are going to talk about a topic that is a bit controversial, but that's part of my purpose for talking about it, just to provide a bit more understanding, because the more people understand a thing, the less stigma surrounds it. So we are going to be talking about STDs and STIs, venereal diseases, however you would like to refer to them. I know venereal diseases is not necessarily a term that people prefer anymore. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But I do want to talk about something that is important. Well, I won't say it's not important, because it is important. It's not necessarily an important thing to me to talk about. It's very personal to talk about, but it's not important to me because I once had an STD quite recently, actually, and it was about a year ago when I found out I had it, but I'm not sure how long I had it before then. And so I want to say it was this time last year, actually, I found out that I contracted HPV. HPV, I like to consider, like, how I conceptualize it in my mind is the common cold of sex. And that's not to say that it's not important, or that it's not, because again, it's not, having it or having had it, I'll say, is not something that's important to me, because again, I had it and it didn't define who I was. And that's my biggest takeaway that I want to talk about in this segment, because later we're going to get into the history and we're going to get into the science of STDs and the different types of STDs and all of that. But right now, my main focus is to take away the stigma surrounding STDs, and to let those of you who may have contracted them and felt shame or whatever about having contracted it, or maybe your perception of self shifted once you contracted it. Please understand, or once you found out you contracted it, please understand, it does not make you a bad person. It does not mean that you are less than anyone. You had sex, it's actually a myth to think that everyone who contracts an STD had sex unprotected, or that they got it from unprotected sex. Because I actually got mine. I got HPV from smoking with someone and sharing I used to smoke marijuana, and so I got it from sharing a pipe with someone, or a blunt, or a joint, or whatever, just from sharing it with someone. And we talked about it and stuff like that, and I had never had sex with this person. This person was just a friend of mine. However, I did contract it from them, and that's just what it was. And that's why I conceptualized it that way, because it's kind of like, what is it? Mono, like the kissing disease. I won't say it's like that, because both can cause terrible harm to one's person. But it is like that. Like, you can get it from simply sharing. If your lips was on something and then that person had it, and if someone's lips touches something and then they share that thing with you and you put your lips on it, it's kind of like you're kissing. Not really, but you are sharing DNA in that way. And it is possible to get HPV in that way. It's possible to get mono in that way. So I found out that I had it back in August of 2019, and the very first thing I did was, it came as a shock. It was, of course it came as a shock, because I won't say I didn't have symptoms. There was a symptom that I did not know about. And that symptom was, I had this, it wasn't a wart per se, but I had like a cyst type deal on my labia. And I just thought it was like a hair bump, like I got from shaving or something. And it was very persistent. It didn't go away. It didn't hurt. It didn't itch or anything. It was just there. And I found out later that is a sign of a symptom of HPV. I had no other symptoms. I was fine. But that was there. But at the time, I was not thinking about it. So I was just like, I don't think I have anything. That's a hair bump. That's fine. But when I took the test, and I probably would have never known had I not I took a home test, a home STD test, and it was because I had another podcast about sex, and I was partnered with someone, or with a brand, and the brand was a home STD testing kit, and I did that, and everything else came back clean, but that. And so I probably would have never known had I not done that. But the thing about HPV is a lot of people contract it and don't know. And it's because you can go and be fine and not have any symptoms, or you can not know what the symptoms look like, or you can, it clears up within a year or two. And so you can have, if you began having sex, say at 16, you could have contracted it, and by the time you're 18, it's gone. It's out of your system. I think it's actually between 6 months and 2 years, not 1 year and 2 years. But but the thing about it is, if there are no symptoms, that is when it's actually the most dangerous, because it can cause more problems down the line, because HPV is something that tends to cause reproductive cancers, such as testicular cancer, ovarian cancer, and cervical cancer. So I won't say I'm glad I had that symptom of that bump, but I know that if it had not produced itself some way, it would have produced itself other ways. And so I've been handling my body kind of crappy, but one thing that I do know is that as long as I take care of my body, it's really not going to do anything to me. As long as I work to heal my body and not kill it, I'll be fine. And what that means is, as long as I consume the foods that will heal me and not kill me, I know I'll be fine. And as long as I move my body and just move it on a daily basis, I'll be fine, because my making sure that I am creating an environment within my body that is conducive to my healing. So that's also why having had contracted it is not something that's important to me. Like, I know it's something that I had at some point, but it doesn't affect me. But I do know that is not the case for everyone, because our bodies are very different, and our bodies manifest things differently. One STD in one person will manifest differently in someone else. And so what I do want to say is, please understand, you're not a disgusting person. You're not a terrible person. You're not an unclean person. You contracted this STD, however you may have contracted it, STD or STI, however you would like to refer to it, which I do tend to think they're two different things, because infections and diseases, when I think diseases, I think I think virus, and when I think, so I would consider HPV a disease because it's viral. So I think of infections more bacterial and diseases more viral, but that's just how I conceptualize it in my mind. That could by definition be very incorrect. But however you have contracted this STI or STD, understand you are not a bad person. Nothing is wrong with you. And people who view people a particular way who have contracted STDs, those people are not disgusting. Those people are not terrible people, because let's be clear, you probably have had an STD or an STI and did not know. And if you did get tested, by the time you took the test, it probably worked its way out of your system if you did. You probably had a UTI at some point. You probably had a yeast infection at some point. A yeast infection is an STI. It's an infection that can be caused from sexual interaction. You can contract a yeast infection from someone else. You could have very possibly had HPV at some point. Not wishing that on anybody, but understand, HPV is a very common STD. Anyone who has sex, that's the one that it's easily contracted, and it's very easy again to work its way out of your system. It tends to work its way out of your system, and you won't even know that you had it. Another thing that stood out to me, I'll say, is when I found out about it at first, because of where my mindset was about having had the STD. So I thought about it, but I also called my most recent partner at the time, and I was crying, and I was so sad, and I felt really bad. But then after that, I also dealt with some low self-esteem, and I felt less sensual, I'm a very sensual, sexual person by nature. And at that moment, I felt like I couldn't be anymore. Or I felt like something was wrong, and that's just how that energy manifested itself in my root and sacral chakra, and I felt that in my body. And so I began to do root and sacral chakra work in order to work that out, in order to also get more in tune with my body again. Because also at that time, I had gotten very out of tune with my body. And I had gotten very out of tune with my sacral chakra because of other things. It wasn't because of that, but it was because of other things. So already, I was not as in tune with my body as I should have been. Which, when you are not as in tune with your body as you should be, you do tend to open yourself up to... I won't say you tend to open yourself up to STDs and STIs, it is easy for them to go unnoticed, I'll say, because you don't know the difference between what your body may feel like in one state compared to the other. But yes, I did feel very unsexual, unsensual. I don't think those are words. But I worked through it. And if you're feeling that way, I promise you, you can too. It's very, very possible. You just have to shift your mindset and also take the shame away. Remove the shame and understand that you are no different. And this can be worked out of you as well. You do not have to hold on to this energy. Do what you need to do to release that particular energy, whatever the energy, whatever the STD, whatever the STI may be. So after this quick break, we are going to break down STDs from history to science. So first, we're going to start with history in the next segment. Where do they come from? Let's find out. So, enjoy these beautiful messages from the GSMC Podcast Network, and we'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
All right, and we are back. So, in the last segment, I talked about how I once contracted HPV and how I felt, how it affected me, and throughout that, and my point in doing that was to take away the shameful stigma of STDs. And so I want to reiterate, having an STD or having contracted an STD or an STI does not make you a bad person. Now, what I will say, what does make you a bad person, not to judge anyone, but if you knowingly have an STD and you pass it along, knowing like this person that I have sex with is going to contract it, you are not a great person. You're not a great person. But just having an STD, that does not make you a bad person. Now we are going to get into the history of STDs. So one thing that I found really interesting was what I mentioned also earlier in the first segment. The term venereal disease is not used anymore. It's not considered a favorable term to be used anymore. And it's because it is less comprehensive than sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection. Because what a venereal disease, and it stopped being used around the 20th century. So what a venereal disease means by definition is any disease transmitted by sexual intercourse. What sexual intercourse is defined as is penile vaginal penetration. That is what sexual intercourse is typically defined as. So that excludes what can be contracted from anal sex, and that excludes what can be contracted from oral sex. And so sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection makes it more all-encompassing. It's like, no, any sexual activity will cause the contraction of any one of these diseases or infections. So thought that was pretty interesting, because I always wonder, like, I've heard people say VD, like, and of course I've always heard it in like older films or older TV shows, like in like the 80s or 90s, and I was like, what is VD? And then I learned it was a venereal disease, and I was like, well, is that not the same as an STD? And so it was kind of cool as I was researching for this episode. It was kind of cool to get those questions answered for myself. And honestly, I don't know why I never got them answered. But some other things that I found interesting regarding the history of STDs is that STDs are not new at all. And when I say they're not new, I mean, like, yes, there are man-made STDs and STIs. We're not going to get into that right now. But they date back to the Middle Ages. And when I read that, I said, really? But it's also not surprising. It's not surprising given the lack of prophylactic use, or the non-existence of it, I'll say. Condoms have not always been here. Male condoms have not always been here. Definitely not female condoms. Dental dams have not always been here. So it makes sense that STDs or infections that are typically contracted via sexual interaction date back that far. It's surprising, but not surprising, because we often tend to think that these are new things, but they are not. They were either called something different or weren't called anything at all. They were just unknown, which really makes me wonder because also with that in mind of how condoms have haven't always existed, and how dental dams and things like that have not always existed. Medical technology has not always been as advanced as it is now, and medicines have not always been as quote-unquote advanced as they are now. So I wonder how these things, like, once these things manifested in a person's body, once these diseases and infections manifested in a person's body, how are they handled? How are they taken care of? Were there shots? Were there elixirs that needed to be taken? Did they turn to herbal medicine? That really raises questions for me. I should have looked those questions up, actually. I may do another episode on that, on the history of healing STDs and how it's evolved over time. That would be pretty cool. But yeah, I found that very interesting. How Sway? And did these people live a long time? Was that a contributing factor to the lower age of deaths during those particular times? Because people were living for shorter periods of time for a very long time. And it was because of the lack thereof of advancement in medical technology or in medicine. So, something to look into. Let's see. I also have in my notes there were Greek and Roman physicians who wrote, and satiric poets who wrote about genital diseases. I really want to look. I'm gonna do another episode, because in the episode we're gonna delve deeper into this stuff, because we only have an hour, and I feel like this would go way beyond an hour if we talk about those things. But yeah, I'm gonna do an episode that goes into the history of healing them, and also the writings that talk about them. That's kind of cool. Also, in reference to those physicians and their satiric poets, Celsus described various diseases of the genitals, and he referred to genitals as obscene parts. So he talked about a variety, apparently, of diseases of the genitals in a lot of his writings. Galen made a strange description of the female genitals and coined the term Gonorrhea. Gonorrhea? That's a mall. Gonorrhea. I combined Galen and gonorrhea. Okay. So, gonorrhea. So he coined the term gonorrhea, and gonorrhea meant, when he coined the term, gonorrhea meant flow of semen. So that's also something that I found interesting. How do you get gonorrhea? Give me a second, because I'm going to look up. That's something I can look up really quick. The etymology of gonorrhea. Or at least the definition of it. Give me just a second. Gonorrhea. Yeah, so the definition of gonorrhea, or what it is Oxford's dictionary says a venereal disease, but that term's not used anymore. But a venereal disease involving inflammatory discharge from the urethra or vagina. However, Galen coined it to mean a flow of semen. Interesting. Okay. Gonna have to look more into the etymology of that. Anyway, back to my notes. The ancient Chinese and Indian physicians also gave some account on the temple sculptures, through their temple sculptures, on the presence of venereal diseases in their books as well. So in their books, I typed that out terribly. In their books and in their sculptures, they make a lot of reference to venereal diseases, or STDs and STIs. And those are Chinese and Indian physicians, once again. And also, during the Middle Ages, numerous physicians and surgeons from Europe, as well as from the Arabic countries, wrote on local diseases of the genitals, describing cancers. This is a difficult word, and I could not pronounce it when I saw it, so give me a second. Condylomata, erosions, pustules, so just pus-filled things, urethral and vaginal discharge, and their treatment. So these things were written about well before now, well into the Middle Ages. And if you want to know what that is, what that word is that I could not pronounce, condylomata comes from the word condyloma, and condyloma is just an elevated wart-like lesion of the skin, so it's just warts. They definitely could have just said warts, but I understand. So, these are just some interesting things that I found about the history of STDs and STIs. I found it very interesting that they weren't new, but again, it also doesn't really shock me, just given the culture and the time period. But it is also interesting to see that as time periods progress, we find that more STDs are discovered, or that more STDs or more strains of a particular STD are discovered, and that these strains tend to be stronger and more aggressive. And so then you have to create more aggressive medicine or more aggressive medical technology. So it's interesting to see. My words are interesting tonight. It's interesting to see that as medicine progresses, so do these STDs, so do these STIs, so do the different strains of them. Which, speaking of strains, we're going to get into a little later in the show. We're going to talk about the different strains of certain diseases and understanding them and understanding why some may be detectable, some are not, why some maybe we don't have enough time to get into all of that, actually. We'll see. Because that's actually a lot of information. But we will look at how there are different strains. We will at least look at how there are different strains of different diseases. And why they may manifest a particular way. So we're going to take another quick break, of course, and we will be right back with the science of STDs. So I will see you in a bit.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, we're back. So, of course, I just talked about the history of STDs and STIs, and now we're going to get into the science. I was able to find some information because I wanted to be sure that I want to provide accurate information. So I want to be sure that I'm using things correctly, not just for other people and for their understanding, but also for my own. So I'm going to get into what I found. But the science of STDs and STIs are simple. Not necessarily, but as I mentioned before, they are infections that are spread via, or infections or diseases that are spread via sexual interaction. However, they are caused by the spreading of a bacteria or a virus. So that's the simple science of it. Another thing that I found that was interesting regarding the science of STDs and STIs, and this is why I say them separately, like as I mentioned before, I view them differently. And I've had a feeling it was because I read it somewhere, but I wasn't sure if I just read it somewhere or made it up in my mind, that infections are different from diseases. But I fact-checked and found some information stating that they are two different things. Yes, they tend to be used interchangeably as synonyms. However, STDs and STIs are two different things. So having an STI, and this is found on stdcheck.com, if you guys want to look it up. So having an STI means that an individual has an infection, but that it has not yet developed into a disease. Take HPV, human papillomavirus, for instance. Typically, a woman with HPV does not have any symptoms, but she carries the virus. She has an STI, but if she develops cervical cancer from HPV, she now has an STD, since cancer is a disease. So, still not exactly what I said, but still what I said. So it's kind of it's kind of like half and half. So I got part of it right and part of it wrong. So infections do differ from STDs. Well, yes, infections do differ from diseases. However, infections can cause or evolve into diseases. It says the same is true for individuals who have chlamydia or gonorrhea infections that develop into pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID. How I thought about it, though, was I just always thought, like, infections are, like, I think I talked about this already. Infections are bacterial while diseases are viral. And that's clearly not correct. that thinking was incorrect. But that's okay. That's okay. Because again, they both can be caused by bacteria. Like an infection can be caused by bacteria or virus. A virus can be a viral infection. But it is possible. They're still two different things because one can evolve into the other. So an infection can evolve into a disease or cause a disease. Kind of like how, like people think HIV and AIDS are the same thing. So HIV is human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS is an autoimmunodeficiency syndrome. I'm gonna save that for another episode because I do want to provide accurate information. I don't just want to fly by the seat of my pants with that information because that is very important information, and I don't want to say anything incorrect. But HIV, what I will say that is absolutely correct is that HIV is not AIDS. HIV can possibly evolve into AIDS, but not always. But just always remember, HIV is not AIDS. AIDS is not HIV. HIV can evolve into AIDS depending on the strain, depending on the person, depending on the immune system of the person, the medicine that they may or may not be taking. It really just depends. And also another thing to keep in mind is that people do not necessarily die from HIV or AIDS. They die from complications with it. And that can be anything, because it is simply not simply, but they are immune system conditions. So they are diseases, and remember the word disease. If you break it down, it's just a dis-ease. So your body is not at ease in a particular state. So it is a dis-ease of the immune system. The immune system is not at ease with these particular, or not in a state of ease with these particular STIs. So it's not correct to say someone died from HIV or AIDS, because more than likely they died from complications with it, and because it is an immune system condition or a dis-ease of the immune system, or they are dis-eases of the immune system. It could have simply been someone catching a cold, and that cold just was very aggressive because their immune system was not strong enough to protect them or fight it off. And also, speaking on HIV, something that's also important to note, to kind of take away the stigma of HIV, there are plenty of people who live with HIV. HIV is not a death sentence. Also, not just live with it, but are married. You can have a fully functional relationship with an STD, but you can have a fully functional relationship with HIV. You can have sex with your partner with HIV. And that just depends on whether or not it goes undetected. You can have reproductive sex or unprotected sex with your partner, and if you seek to reproductive sex, if you seek to have children, in that process, it can be unprotected, and you won't necessarily catch the virus or contract the virus. Nor will your children. It's very possible for that to take place, for a person to be HIV positive, but their partner can be negative, and they have children, and the children are negative. It's very possible, because it also is important to understand, as I mentioned, the progression of medicine. There are things that exist like PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. Which is a pill that can be taken to protect yourself from the HIV virus. We're also, when I do this next episode, I'm also going to have to talk about some of the issues with HIV and the healthcare system, and with things like PrEP, because PrEP is also not necessarily affordable. So we will get into that as well. We'll talk more about what PrEP is and how effective it is and things like that. From what I've heard, it's very effective. From what I've heard, the medications for and from what I've researched, the medications for maintaining and managing with HIV are very, very effective. But again, they're not always affordable. So we have to get into that. We have to get into how these STDs and STIs can affect people in more ways than one. So that may be an episode all on its own. So 2 episodes can come from this. But yeah, that's really all I have on the science of it, of STDs and STIs. Because the more I researched about the science of STDs and STIs, it got into breaking down specific STDs and STIs. So if I don't mind doing that. I don't mind having episodes dedicated to specific STIs and STDs. So I'll do that. So this will spawn a few episodes. So this will be like a base episode or a prequel episode, even though prequels tend to come after us. Oh well, this is an introduction, I'll say, and we'll just each episode after will just essentially be spawned from this conversation. So the next episode is going to be a diving deeper. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Because there's a lot of information and a lot of ground to cover regarding STDs and STIs that are so much more than just protecting yourself, but also protect yourself. So if you have access to PrEP, use it. If you have access to condoms, use them, because some people don't have access to condoms. If you have access to, and if you don't have access to condoms and you have no other way of protecting yourself during sex, don't want to be that Southern person, but abstinence. Again, that is only if you don't have access to methods of protection. And I mean, outside of testing, but also if you don't have access to testing, and if you don't have access to, also just in general, if you don't have access to birth control, which this has nothing to do with STDs and STIs, but sex. So if you don't have access to birth control, try to figure out natural methods of birth control. There are plenty of them, and I could probably do a whole episode on that as well. So yeah, just keep yourself protected always, 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 in all ways, always in all ways, keep yourself protected. So, in our final segment, we are going to talk about some fun facts about STDs, which fun is not the operative word here, but so just some facts, and maybe we can debunk some myths while going through these facts. And we're also going to talk about what the different STDs are. So yeah, we're going to take a quick break again, and I will see you soon.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Alright, now let's get into some STD facts. So the first one, women are more susceptible to STDs than men. When I first heard this, I thought it was a myth, but then I did further research and I realized it wasn't. So what this says, and I got this from Everyday Health. What it says is it has nothing to do with promiscuity, of course. Women are more vulnerable to infections than men because of their anatomy, because of our anatomy. So our vaginas are a breeding ground for bacteria of all kinds, and it is easier for if we're not careful, it is easier for bacteria to manifest in a negative way. And it is easier for bacteria to kind of fester, essentially. And that's just because of the environment. Bacteria thrives in warm and moist environments, and vaginas tend to be warm and moist, and also not very spacious. I won't say not very spacious because whole children come out, but they tend to be very small. The bacteria thrives in small, hot, or warm, moist areas or environments, and that is typically what the vagina is. And the vagina also tends to be very acidic, which also kind of adds an extra layer of that multiplying of bacteria and festering of bacteria. What is this next one? Oh, it also further says here on Everyday Health, in addition, in many cases, the consequences of untreated STDs are worse for women than for men. Untreated chlamydia, for example, can spread to the uterus and fallopian tubes, where it can cause pelvic inflammatory disease, potentially leading to chronic pelvic pain and infertility. Unfortunately, it is a bit more difficult for STDs and STIs to be not found. It's more difficult for us to notice that we have them. Like, they can go very undetected. They can go undetected for long periods of time, and it's just easier. And I hate that. Like, I thought that was a myth as well, but it's just easier for them to go undetected, and so that's why it is important. And I wonder sometimes, why is it easier for them to go undetected? Is it because of our anatomy, or is it because we have been conditioned to be out of tune with our bodies, and so we just don't know when something is off? So that's why I think it's important to pay attention to your womb, to take stock in your womb and your yoni, your vagina, however you want to refer to it as. It is very important to get in tune with that part of yourself and to understand it, not only from a physical level, but from an energetic level as well. To know, it's important to know what you feel like when you are in balance, and what you feel like when you are out of balance. And I mean that in a physical way, in a sexual way, as far as your vagina is concerned, as far as your brain is concerned. It's important to know what you feel like when you are in balance and when you are out of balance, so that you can have that relationship with yourself. And in having that relationship with yourself, things won't always, it will be less frequent for diseases to go undetected in your body. So the next fact is there are more than 25 known STDs. When I did my research, it said about 30, but there could very well be more. The most common STDs are chlamydia, gonorrhea, hepatitis B, genital herpes, HIV, human papillomavirus, syphilis, pubic lice, also called crabs, and trichomoniasis. Also, each of these STDs, these are STIs, each of these STIs have different strains. So, and I mentioned that earlier, because of the different strains, they may show up, they may manifest differently, they may not, it really just depends. Especially for HPV, there are over 100 strains of HPV. And I think because my mom, when I told my mom that I had it, she couldn't really understand. She was like, well, I thought you had the Gardasil. Like, I remember you getting the Gardasil shot. Now, there were 3 rounds of that shot, and I only got 2. So, I thought that was the reason why, like, I contracted it. However, that Gardasil, or the vaccinations for it, the vaccinations for HPV only cover about 40 of those strains. And so, and those strains are the ones that are like the more aggressive ones, and the more, the ones that are typically sexually transmitted. Well, no, because of those 40, I think about 12 are, what is it? Of those 40, 12 are like highly aggressive, but the 40 are the ones that tend to be sexually transmitted. Really hope I'm saying this right. I believe I am, but yeah, and I get mine wasn't necessarily sexually transmitted, so the strain that I had, and also that means that particular strain was probably not protected by that vaccination. So yeah, vaccinations exist, but because there are so many strains of STIs, you really just have to be careful. You have to be as careful as possible. Yeah. So the next fact: STDs can be transmitted through oral sex. We talked about that and why the name or the word venereal disease is kind of nixed, and it was because it's not as inclusive. Again, venereal disease was defined as a disease that was transferred through sexual intercourse. Oral sex is not considered intercourse. It's because you're not necessarily entering anything. Oral sex, the penis enters with fellatio, a penis enters a mouth, but that's not what intersex is. Intersex, that's definitely not what intersex is, but it's not what intercourse is, or not what intercourse is considered to be. So, again, STIs and STD came about as terms because they were more inclusive. They are sexually transmitted, period. It doesn't have to be just through intercourse. And so this fact here reiterates that STDs can be transmitted through oral sex. So oral sex puts you at especially high risk for gonorrhea, syphilis, herpes, and hepatitis B. Most STDs travel from person to person through semen, vaginal fluids, and blood. Some, such as Molluscum Contagiosum, scabies, and pubic lice, spread just through skin-to-skin contact. And HPV is also one of those that can spread through skin-to-skin contact, particularly skin-to-skin contact of genitals, or of lips, apparently. But I don't know I don't know exactly when I contracted it, and so there's no telling what my friend had been doing that day sexually, because my friend could have performed oral sex on their partner at the time and could have contracted it that way, and then we smoked after, and there's no telling. So they very well could have had vaginal fluids on their lips or something. So the next one: STDs are treatable, but not all are curable. Bacterial STDs like chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis can be cured with antibiotics. Pubic lice and scabies can be cured with insecticides. but viral STDs like herpes, hepatitis B, HIV, HPV, and genital warts, which are caused by HPV, are incurable, though they can be managed. And like when I first read about HPV, I got scared because it was like, it's incurable, oh no. But because I've come to understand natural medicine, nothing is incurable, not in my mind. So again, I already had the mindset like, okay, if I just take care of myself, I'll be all right. As long as I eat the correct foods and things of that nature, which I have not been doing lately, but I'm getting back to it. But you know, if I take care of myself and do what I need to do, I'll be fine. It is curable. And again, if your immune system is like doing what it's supposed to do, HPV will tend to work its way out of your system between 6 and 24 months, or 6 months to 6 months to 2 years. So, no, it just depends. Number 5, some STDs are asymptomatic. Certain sexually transmitted infections have no noticeable symptoms, so you may not know that you or your partner has been infected. I spoke about that earlier. It is very possible for you to have once had an STD of some sort and have not known. Number 6, untreated STDs can have serious health consequences, which we also talked about beforehand, or probably a few facts ago, actually. Yeah, I think that was the very first one. In the very first one, they talked about that, or touched on it a bit, about how if in women, if chlamydia goes untreated, it can cause PID or infertility. Number 7, men who have sex with men have the highest rates of syphilis. And it says here the number of cases of primary and secondary. I don't like that they included that in this. It sounds like it's singling people out. I'm not going to read that further because that's not what we do here. We don't single people out. We don't. I'm not reading that. If y'all want to see that, it's on everydayhealth.com. I don't feel right reading that. And that's just because I don't. It just. Though it very well may be a fact, it being included seems like there's an agenda there, and I don't like that. Number 8, most doctors don't routinely screen for STDs, which is why it is very important for you to put the power in your own hands to get tested. Because most times a doctor is not going to say, hey, let's test you for some STDs. My very first STD test, I was 16, and I'll say insurance doesn't even cover STD tests, or the insurance that I had didn't cover them because I had to come out of pocket like $250 for a gonorrhea test and a chlamydia test because I was 16 and I was considered a minor, and I got tested at my pediatrician. And with your pediatrician, or with my pediatrician at least, the only thing that they could test me for was gonorrhea and chlamydia. Were the only things they could test me for were gonorrhea and chlamydia. And so my mom was upset. That was a whole ordeal, and I had to come out of pocket. I didn't have anything, but the pretenses for me getting tested, my mom was upset about, and she made me come out of pocket. And it was $250 for the test. So, and then the last one that is very important. Last 2. Condoms aren't a guarantee against STDs. I said that earlier as well. You really just have to be careful, be aware of who you're having sex with, who you're interacting with, because condoms do not guarantee. Herpes can be transferred while wearing condoms. Herpes can start off as a cold sore, and if you perform oral sex on somebody while you have that cold sore, then it can become genital herpes. And the last one, I talked about this early on, like the very first segment, nearly all sexually active men and women have an HPV infection at some point. So you may not have it like in your system anymore, but it's very possible once again, for you to have had that infection. So those are all of the facts, the STD facts that I found. I hope you enjoyed them. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And I just want to thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. And I will see you all next week. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.